We're all seeing large language models, LLMs tackle increasingly complex tasks. They're pretty amazing, right?
Absolutely. But for those of us working in the field, we also know they still hit a wall sometimes, especially with really sophisticated multi-step reasoning or deep planning.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Think about navigating a complex problem where you really need to explore many possibilities at once, like searching a huge graph structure.
Right. And traditional chain of thought, or CoT, where the LLM generates one token, one step at a time, it can be incredibly slow.
Yeah.
And often inefficient.
It's like trying to find your way through a giant maze by just meticulously trying one single path after another.
Exactly. You might get there eventually, but it's definitely not optimal. Mm-hmm. And often these LLMs just get stuck in local dead ends.
And that is precisely where today's deep dive comes in. What if LLMs could think not just step by step, but in a continuous sort of parallel way?
Okay. So moving beyond the discrete tokens.
Exactly. Our mission today is to unpack a really groundbreaking paper that introduces something called chain of continuous thought, or CoCoT.
CoCoT, okay.
And it leverages this fascinating concept called superposition states to fundamentally change how LLMs reason. The implications for efficiency are frankly stunning.
Okay, so this paper provides the theory behind why this continuous approach might outperform the discrete one we're used to.
Precisely. And for researchers and engineers listening, here's the absolute core insight, the 1-minute version. This paper proves that a 2-layer transformer using this continuous CoT can solve the directed graph reachability problem in just D steps.
D steps, where D is the graph's diameter.
Yes, the diameter, the longest, shortest path.
Okay, wow. Because the best discrete CoT models, they need, ON2. So where it is the number of vertices.
Exactly, ON2. So we're talking potentially an exponential speed up. It's a complete game changer for efficiency on these kinds of complex reasoning tasks.
And the key you mentioned is these superposition states.
Yeah, the continuous thought vectors act like these superposition states. They let the model explore multiple possibilities simultaneously. It's almost like running a parallel breadth-first search inside the model's head.
Which is totally different from discrete CoT, where it's forced to pick just one path sequentially, a single collapse state, like you said.
And maybe the most mind-bending part, this superpositional representation, this parallel thinking capability, it isn't explicitly programmed. It seems to just emerge automatically during training.
It learns to do this on its own. That's pretty wild. It suggests some really deep emergent properties in these networks.
Right. So before we dive fully into CoCoT, let's just double click on why the current chain of thought, despite being useful, hits that wall. What are its fundamental limits?
Sure. So CoCoT has been revolutionary, no question about it. It's that whole technique where LLMs generate those thinking tokens, right? The intermediate steps before the final answer.
Yeah, and it's been super powerful. We've seen it tackle seriously hard math problems, like from the A exams or even complex theorem proving. It definitely adds transparency and boosts accuracy sometimes.
Definitely boosted accuracy.
Yeah.
But despite those strengths, LLMs with discrete CoT still really struggle with problems that need truly sophisticated, scaled reasoning. And planning.
Like the graph reachability you mentioned, just finding if a path exists between two nodes.
Exactly. For a standard transformer using discrete CoT, even one with constant depth, it takes that enormous ON2 decoding steps, and it being the number of vertices.
Oh, 2. I mean, that just sounds computationally brutal for any reasonably large graph. Is it just the number of steps, or is there a deeper issue?
Well, it's both, really. The ON2 makes it practically impossible for many real-world graphs. But maybe more fundamentally, the discrete tokens force the model to commit, to pick a single path at each step. It leads to this sequential search, which is just inherently inefficient for many problems. And it's prone to getting stuck in bad paths or just running out of steam out of its context window or step limit. It forces a sort of greedy, maybe depth-first approach when you really need a broader view.
The sequential bottleneck. That's exactly the problem CoCoT tries to break through, and that's where this whole superposition idea gets really interesting.
Right, the chain of continuous thought technique from Howe and colleagues. Using continuous latent thoughts, these dense vectors, instead of the individual discrete tokens.
And they show it works, right, empirically?
Oh yeah, the results look really compelling.
Okay.
CoCoT showed big performance boosts on synthetic tasks like that graph reachability, but also on real-world math benchmarks like GSM-8K. So it's not just a theoretical curiosity, it's delivering practical gains.
The paper mentions this aha moment, this hypothesis that the continuous latent thought could maybe store multiple candidate search frontiers at the same time?
Yeah, like a mental map showing different routes simultaneously.
That's like quantum superposition, but, as an analogy for neural nets.
Exactly. It's a useful analogy.
Yeah.
It means a single continuous thought vector isn't forced to just represent one thing. It can simultaneously hold information about many different reachable nodes, many potential paths, all weighted by relevance.
So it's holding multiple possibilities open in parallel.
Whereas discrete CoT is like that collapsed state. It has to pick one branch. It forces that inefficient sequential search we talked about.
Which makes graph reachability such a perfect test case, right?
Totally. It's general enough to represent fundamental problems, like you could encode things related to the Turing machine halting problem in it, but it's also super practical. Think knowledge graphs, finding connections, or planning complex action sequences.
Okay, so we get the problem with discrete and the promise of continuous superposition, but how does a transformer, which usually processes things token by token, actually manage this parallel state? What's the mechanism?
Right, so the paper actually constructs a theoretical model to show how it can work. It relies on a couple of clever building blocks.
Okay.
First, they use specific token embeddings. They're designed to be orthonormal, meaning they're perfectly distinct. Think of it like having separate dedicated spaces or channels within the embedding for different kinds of info. One for content, others maybe as temporary buffers.
So information doesn't get mixed up as easily.
Exactly. It helps keep things clean. And then there's this really neat component they call the attention chooser.
Attention chooser.
Yeah. They construct the transformer with specific attention heads that act like, choosers. A token at position can be designed to almost exclusively pay attention to a specific relative position, like I2 or I1, if it's a certain type of token, like an edge token.
So it allows for very targeted information copying, like grabbing the source and target node info for an edge?
Precisely. Flexible and efficient information routing. And importantly, they show this works with standard positional encodings like sinusoidal or rho-p.
Okay, so you have these building blocks. How do they maintain the superposition state? That's the magic part, right? The parallel BFS.
That's the core, yeah. The proof shows how each continuous thought vector, let's call it TC for the CC thought, effectively becomes a normalized superposition of all the vertices you could reach from the starting node R within exactly C steps.
So it is performing a parallel breadth-first search?
Functionally, yes. Here's how the layers work together. Layer 1 attention is mostly about setup. Specific heads copy key information. For example, an edge token uses its attention chooser head to copy its source node into one buffer space and its target node into another buffer space.
Okay, getting the pieces ready.
Then layer 2 attention does the heavy lifting, the expansion. The current continuous thought seeker, which is that superposition of reachable nodes, it basically queries all the edge tokens. If an edge's source node, which layer 1 put in buffer 1, is in the current superposition TRA, the model pays a large amount of attention to that edge. And crucially, it then adds the target node of that edge from buffer 2 back into the continuous thought vector for the next step, CL plus 1.
So if a node is reachable, it finds the edges starting from it and adds the nodes those edges point to into the next superposition state. That's the wave spreading out.
Exactly. That's how the superposition expands from VC nodes reachable in C steps to VC plus 1.
But what about noise or uneven weights? Does it stay clean?
Good point. That's where the MLP, the multi-layer perceptron that follows the attention layers, comes in. It acts like a filter. After attention, the weights might be a bit messy. Some nodes might have stronger signals than others. There might be noise. The MLP essentially cleans it up. It normalizes things, equalizing the weights of the valid nodes in the new superposition and filtering out noise tokens that have very small weights.
Keeps the signal clear for the next step.
Right. And this whole construction, the embeddings, the attention choosers, the two layers interacting, the MLP filter, leads to their main theorem.
Which is?
That a two-layer transformer with general positional encodings and, importantly, parameters that don't depend on the specific graph can solve graph reachability reliably in D steps.
D steps still sounds amazing, but does it actually work? Like when they train a real model?
The million-dollar question. So yes, they did empirical validation.
What was the setup?
Surprisingly modest, actually. They trained a GPT-2 style decoder, but with only 2 transformer layers. Just 2. 8 attention heads, D model of 768. Pretty small by today's standards.
Okay.
They trained it on a data set called ProsQA, which focuses on graph problems needing maybe 3 or 4 reasoning hops.
And the results?
Honestly, pretty stunning. CoCoT got near perfect accuracy, around 99% on ProsQA.
99% with just 2 layers?
Yep. And now compare that. Discrete CoCoT baselines, even a much larger 12-layer model with 12 heads, they only reached about 75% to 83% accuracy on the same tasks.
Wow. So a much smaller, specialized model using continuous thought absolutely crushed a bigger general model using discrete steps.
It's a really clear demonstration, huge implications for efficiency, right? Maybe we don't always need massive models if we have the right reasoning mechanisms.
Definitely. Did they look inside the model to see if it was actually doing what the theory predicted?
They did. They visualized the latent reasoning, and it lines up beautifully. In layer 1, the attention maps confirm that edge tokens really did focus almost all their attention on their source and target nodes, just like the copying mechanism designed.
Okay, so the setup works. What about layer 2, the expansion?
That also worked as theorized.
Yeah.
The model sharply focused its attention on what they call reachable edges, those whose source node was actually in the current superposition state.
Makes sense.
But here's where it got even more interesting. They found an additional bias. The model seemed to pay even more attention to frontier nodes that were exactly I steps away, the very edge of the search wave.
Okay, prioritizing the active search front, that seems smart.
And even more surprising, there was also a bias towards optimal nodes, those that were actually part of the correct solution path to the target.
Whoa, wait, how would it know the optimal path during the search?
Great question. That suggested something more complex than just a pure uniform BFS might be emerging.
Did they look at the continuous thought vectors themselves?
Yes. They analyzed the similarity, the inner product, between the continuous thought vectors tie and the embeddings of all the nodes.
Yeah.
And it confirmed the structure. Nodes within IHOPs were much more similar to the I thought vector than nodes further away. Frontier nodes were even closer. And optimal nodes, they were the closest, the most strongly represented in the thought vector.
So the vector really does encode this weighted, parallel representation of reachable nodes with a clear emphasis on the frontier and somehow even the optimal path.
Exactly.
Right.
It's visual proof that this superposition isn't just theory, it's happening.
Okay, but back to that optimal path bias. That's super intriguing. Did they figure out why? Was it just because of how they trained it, maybe guiding it towards the answer?
That was the next critical question they tackled. Was this bias just an artifact of their training, which used a multi-stage approach that did provide some guidance on the optimal path?
Right, maybe it just learned to cheat a bit based on the training signal.
To test that, they created a variation called Gokunad BFS. In this version, the supervision signal during training was drawn randomly from any node on the current frontier, not specifically the nodes on the optimal path.
Ah, so it wasn't being explicitly told, this is the right way, just explore outwards from here.
Exactly, more like a pure BFS training signal.
And what happened?
This is the remarkable part. CoCoT BFS still achieved near perfect accuracy.
Wow.
And it converged to very similar exploration strategies. It still showed that elevated attention weight for frontier nodes, even the non-optimal ones.
So that prioritization of the frontier, that outward expansion focus seems inherent. It's not just because of the optimal path training.
It strongly suggests that, yeah, that this breadth-first expansion and the focus on the active search areas are fundamental properties of how continuous CoCoT works in this setup, even without explicit guidance towards the solution. It's an emergent exploration strategy.
That's fascinating. It feels like we're just scratching the surface here.
Yeah.
What are the big open questions this research leaves us with?
Oh, several really exciting ones for the field. First, can we formally prove a lower bound for discrete CoT on these kinds of problems? Really nail down mathematically how much better continuous CoT can be.
Cement the gap?
Right. Second, can we get a deeper theoretical understanding of why this emergent exploration behavior happens? Why does it learn to prioritize frontier nodes and even optimal ones sometimes during training? That feels like a really fundamental question about learning in continuous latent spaces.
Understanding the learning dynamics themselves.
Exactly. And finally, the big one. What are the advantages of reasoning in this continuous space for more general, more complex reasoning problems beyond graph reachability? This feels like just the first step.
Yeah, it really does. So to wrap things up for everyone listening, today you've really taken a deep dive into how this chain of continuous thought, CoCoT, uses these superposition states to let LLMs solve complex reasoning like graph problems, potentially way more efficiently than traditional discrete methods.
The core idea is shifting from sequential steps to parallel thinking, exploring many possibilities at once within these continuous vectors.
And the key takeaway for you, the listener, is that this isn't just some abstract theory. It's a practical leap. It suggests we could potentially build smaller, faster, more efficient LLMs that can tackle problems previously thought too slow or just too complex for current models.
It really gives us a glimpse into a future where LLMs might think in a much richer, more multifaceted way. Less step-by-step instruction following, more holistic processing.
Which leads us to that final provocative thought to leave you with.
If continuous thought lets LLMs handle multiple possibilities so well for graph problems, what other really complex tasks could this unlock? Think about combinatorial optimization, intricate planning problems, maybe even scientific discovery.
How might this change how we design AI for decision-making?
Right.
Are we moving beyond just step-by-step reasoning towards something that feels more like integrated understanding? It certainly hints at a potentially new and exciting paradigm for AI reasoning.